Welcome back. Last episode, we stared into the abyss of autocratic survival, focusing on the sharp end, repression and the crucial loyalty of security forces. We saw how a unified coercive apparatus willing to use force presents a formidable, often insurmountable, barrier to mass movements aiming for regime change. But the story isn't just about boots and batons on the ground domestically. Autocratic regimes don't exist in a vacuum. Their survival can also depend heavily on external lifelines and, conversely, on the internal weaknesses of the very movements challenging them. Today, we broaden our focus to these other critical dimensions. We'll examine, first, the role of international support, the geopolitical patrons keeping beleaguered autocrats afloat. Second, the persistent problem of movement fragmentation, when the opposition spends as much energy fighting itself as the regime. And third, regime adaptation, the often underestimated ability of autocrats to learn, adjust, and outmaneuver their challengers. Let's peel back more layers of authoritarian resilience. First up, let's talk about friends in high places, or perhaps geopolitically convenient places. Autocrats under pressure often rely on external support, a factor Oshin Tansey and others highlight in the study of international authoritarianism. Recent work by Tallstrup and Kendall Taylor expands this framework, showing how autocratic patrons are becoming increasingly sophisticated in their support mechanisms. While democratic states might talk about sanctions or human rights pressure, there's often a counter-network of authoritarian cooperation. Geopolitical patrons can provide crucial lifelines. This isn't just symbolic. We're talking tangible aid, weapons to repress protesters, cash to stabilize the economy and pay loyalists, sophisticated surveillance tech to monitor the opposition. Equally important is diplomatic cover, using veto power at the UN, muddying the waters with disinformation, loudly proclaiming sovereignty and non-interference while propping up the regime. A growing area is digital support, sharing tools and techniques for controlling information spaces, censoring communications, and deploying coordinated disinformation campaigns. Some research even tries to quantify this, suggesting, as shown on the slide, that significant external aid during protest periods correlates strongly with regime survival. Essentially, a geopolitical subsidy for repression. The contrast between Syria and Tunisia during the Arab Spring is stark and illustrative. Bashar al-Assad received unwavering military, economic, and diplomatic backing from Russia and Iran, which was instrumental in his brutal survival. Zine El Abidine Ben Ali in Tunisia, on the other hand, found himself relatively isolated. His traditional Western partners quickly distanced themselves once his position looked untenable. Lacking powerful patrons willing to go all in proved fatal for his regime. And for a more recent example, look at Belarus in 2020. Despite facing the largest protests in the country's history, Alexander Lukashenko weathered the storm with crucial Russian backing, including a $1.5 billion economic lifeline, intelligence sharing, and coordinated media narratives that delegitimized protesters as Western puppets. While external patrons provide a shield, internal divisions within the protest movement can act like a self-inflicted wound. It's a depressingly common story. The opposition, facing a brutal regime, somehow finds the time and energy for vicious infighting. This links back to our core theories. From a resource mobilization perspective, fragmentation is disastrous. It wastes precious resources, creates confusing or contradictory messaging, and paralyses strategic decision-making. From a collective action standpoint, different factions might have different ultimate goals, leading to coordination problems and even groups trying to benefit from the risks taken by others. Why does this happen? The reasons are legion, as listed on the slide. Genuine ideological disagreements, clashes between ambitious leaders, arguments over tactics, pre-existing societal fault lines like ethnicity or region. And increasingly, we see fragmentation exacerbated by digital dimensions, where different segments of the opposition operate in separate online spaces with limited interaction, creating echo chambers that harden factional differences. Let's not forget, regimes are often adept at exploiting or creating these divisions through infiltration, disinformation, or by offering deals to one faction but not another. Classic divide and rule. The impact is clear. A fragmented opposition struggles to articulate a coherent vision, negotiate effectively, or sustain coordinated pressure. It makes the movement look weak and makes it easier for the regime to dismiss or pick off its opponents one by one. Venezuela's long-running opposition struggle provides a textbook, if tragic, example of how persistent fragmentation can undermine even widespread popular discontent. For a more recent case, Sudan's experience is instructive. In 2019, a relatively unified opposition successfully toppled Omar al-Bashir, but subsequent splits between civilian groups created openings that the military exploited, leading to the October 2021 coup and the devastating civil war we've seen unfold into 2023 and beyond. Finally, we often underestimate the capacity of autocratic regimes to learn and adapt. They aren't dinosaurs waiting for extinction, they're often nimble survivors. Scholars like Stephen Heidemann and Reinoud Leenders talk about authoritarian learning. Regimes actively study what works and what doesn't, both in their own country and by observing crises elsewhere. Recent research by Finkel and Brudney highlights how this learning has become increasingly sophisticated, with regimes focusing on preemptive adaptation, identifying and neutralizing potential threats before they reach critical mass. Think of it as autocrats attending survival seminars, sharing best practices in repression, co-optation, and propaganda. This adaptation takes many forms. They might refine their repressive tactics, perhaps shifting from overt violence to more subtle digital surveillance and legal harassment. They might learn to make strategic concessions, giving ground on a specific unpopular policy to diffuse a crisis, without touching the core political system. They get better at propaganda, at wrapping themselves in the flag, at painting opponents as foreign agents or terrorists. A particularly effective approach is legal weaponization, creating seemingly legitimate legal frameworks that nevertheless serve to constrain opposition. They might even introduce minor institutional reforms designed purely for show. A recent example is China's handling of the widespread protests against its zero-COVID policies in late 2022. The regime made a remarkably swift U-turn, abandoning the deeply unpopular policy itself. This addressed the immediate, specific grievance that drove people into the streets. But simultaneously, the state apparatus quietly identified, detained, and intimidated many participants, reinforcing its underlying control. Russia provides another instructive case, from its relatively crude response to the Bolotnaya protests in 2011 and 2012, to its sophisticated multi-layered approach to neutralizing Alexei Navalny's movement a decade later. We see a clear evolution: better targeted legal constraints, more sophisticated surveillance, tighter control of information spaces, and more effective narrative management. And of course, regimes that manage to keep the economy reasonably stable generally find it easier to adapt and maintain control. Money provides a crucial buffer. So let's bring today's threads together. We've moved beyond the immediate tools of repression and loyalty explored last time to see other layers protecting autocratic regimes. We examined the crucial role of international support, where external patrons can provide the resources and legitimacy shield needed to survive domestic upheaval, contrasting the fates of Syria, Tunisia, and more recently, Belarus. We delved into the internal dynamics of movement fragmentation, highlighting how infighting and disunity can fatally undermine opposition efforts, using Venezuela and Sudan as examples. And we discussed regime adaptation, emphasizing that autocrats aren't static targets, but often learn and adjust their strategies to maintain power, as seen in China's response to the COVID protests and Russia's increasingly sophisticated approach to containing dissent. What are the key insights here? First, geopolitics casts a long shadow. The survival of an autocrat can depend heavily on their international Rolodex. Second, for protest movements, internal cohesion is not a luxury but a necessity, yet it's often agonizingly elusive precisely when it's needed most. Third, we must recognize that autocratic regimes are often learning, adapting systems. They adjust tactics, manage perceptions, and make calculated concessions. Beating them requires anticipating these moves. And crucially, these challenges don't exist in isolation. They interact and reinforce each other, creating a multi-layered fortress against change. This concludes our deep dive into the specific challenges faced in autocratic contexts. But what about protests in countries that are, at least nominally, democratic? Surely overthrowing a democracy via protest is rare too, but for different reasons. That's where we head next. In Episode 4, we'll explore the distinct challenges movements face in democratic systems, looking at how institutions often absorb protest energy and how phenomena like protest fatigue can set in. It promises a different flavor of disappointment. Until then, this is Kaede signing off.